Thank you, Dominic. As Dominic kindly pointed out, I have recently moved from Infrastructure Australia to Infrastructure Partnerships Australia. I'm grateful that he continued the opportunity for me to speak here and didn't pull it out from underneath me. I think it gives me a good opportunity to maybe speak with a little bit more freedom. I'm not speaking on behalf of IA. I want to make that clear at the outset. I don't have a sort of risk disclaimer, but I'm certainly not speaking on behalf of IA, but I am speaking on behalf of IPA, and I'm happy to draw on my experience from IA. It's not a huge leap from it's sort of an independent government agency, and I would say it is an independent government agency. It has an independent board, and I worked there for a long time. It's a genuinely independent organisation. It may just not always be that effective, and maybe there are ways to improve the processes, but calls to sort of question its independence, I think, are fundamentally flawed. However, I'm now at another independent agency, and this independent agency has 40% government members. So it's not a huge leap. My email is confusingly similar for anyone who had it previously. But I'm happy to draw on the experience that I had at Infrastructure Australia. So those of you who don't know, as I said, we're 40% government members. We are obviously industry, investors, all the rest. It's a genuine think tank as an infrastructure agency. It's owned by the members, but it's very much looking out into the future rather than protecting what exists in the past. And that's why it was a very happy move for me to move across there. The topic that Dominic and I discussed before I moved and when I was at Infrastructure Australia was around users and how infrastructure can deliver better outcomes for users. Dominic kindly asked me if I'd like to change that topic when I moved. I think it's even more important from an industry perspective to look at it that way, and I genuinely don't think that there's any kind of friction there. I think it's a fairly seamless transition. I think government and industry work best when they're both focusing on the same thing, which is ultimately delivering better outcomes for users. So a quick run through of what I want to talk about today. I was the author of the Infrastructure Decision-Making Principles when I was at IA, so again, not speaking on behalf of IA, but I'll speak about them. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail around why we're seeing the bad behaviour. It's probably a fairly simple explanation. It's not going to take a long time, but to tease out some of the issues that we see in and around ministers and ministerial offices. Propose a better way to build public support. There is a better way. I think all of us know what that is and it's been discussed, but to really talk about what that means in terms of infrastructure scoping and problem identification. I'm going to go a little bit into the benefit stack and talking a little bit about business cases and how the strategic case of infrastructure is built. And then finish off with a little bit on the pipeline and because I'm going to be selfish, I'm going to talk a little bit about a reform that I'm really passionate about and I think goes hand in hand with work to improve investment decisions. So, Infrastructure Decision-Making Principles. It was a terrible name. It kind of does what it says on the tin. It had about 74 different names and we ran through lots of different acronyms as you do in a government organisation. Any allegations of being similar to Utopia are vastly justified. But what it does is lays out in very simple terms what the kind of rules of the game are. Now, the process was relatively straightforward in that it was devised in an hour on a whiteboard. There was no great process to it. The whole idea of the principles is that they are statements of fact and statements of logic. They're things that all of us know a lot about and all of us are calling for, but they're also the rules that a lot of ministers and governments are not necessarily playing by. So there are 11 principles. We originally had 10, but then it seemed a little bit like the 10 Commandments coming from Mount Sinai, and we thought, we'll throw another one in there. I won't tell you which one that was. And it deals with everything across the project life cycle from planning and problem identification through to the very rare infrastructure Pokemon of post-completion reviews. Don't see a lot of those around, but we'd love to see more. I think it's the shortest ever document produced by IA, in that I think it was about 4 pages, 2 pages of content. We did that so that nobody can claim that they didn't read it and nobody can claim that they don't understand it because it is so simple and so straightforward that we wanted everyone in every ministerial office and everyone in the community to be reading it and judging governments by those rules. So they were drafted quite quickly. They didn't take a lot. The process wasn't deep. That's kind of the point. It's very clear to the community when the rules are not being met. It's very clear to ministers themselves when the rules are not being met. So why the bad behaviour? It's pretty obvious what the reason is. There's a great incentive to do the wrong thing and not much disincentive not to. When you're focused on the next election, infrastructure as a long-term undertaking is a very different kettle of fish to delivering best outcomes over a long-term horizon. And if we know anything about politics in Australia, it's become increasingly short-term over the last decade. So the headlines that we see are no mystery. There are negative headlines, there are positive headlines. In some respects, it seems like almost any headline is a good headline for some governments. But having said that, we clearly see that rushed planning decisions are leading to poorer outcomes. It's not that governments and ministers don't know what's right. Clearly, the establishment of independent agencies like Infrastructure Australia and the independent agencies that I believe are in all jurisdictions except Northern Territory now in some form or other is an indication that governments know what they need to do and they're happy to set up an architecture around them to do the right thing. It's just that they don't necessarily allow themselves to be guided when push comes to shove. Australians have a great bullshit detector. I think it's something that every Australian or most Australians are very proud of, but somehow in infrastructure we sort of pull the plug on that bullshit detector the moment that there are some architectural sketches run under our noses of a new road or a new hospital or, God forbid, high-speed rail. And I think that's a real critical failing there, that there is a nexus of understanding of ministers in that they know what people want. They know what people want in the short term. It's about selling them on what they need in the long term that is the challenge. So there's always a quick win there, and that's why we see largely rushed planning decisions to start with. Clearly, the approach is not sustainable. The scale of projects has never been greater. Population growth and increasing density means there's more tunnelling and more complex construction than ever before. Rising costs and risks mean delays and erosion of user benefits over time. So what should we do? I think there is a better way. We know that there's a better way, and it could yield benefits for users over the long term. God knows it could even deliver benefits to politicians over the long term. I'm not going to spend the rest of my time just reiterating the 11 infrastructure decision-making principles. I think that might be a useful kind of thing to do in some environments, but I think I'm going to go a little bit deeper and talk about what sits underneath those. To start with, and to disappoint, I'm sure, a lot of the engineers in the room, I've drawn a wholly unscientific graph. So this is, broadly speaking, what we see in terms of infrastructure planning and decision-making. Politicians view it through the lens of public sentiment. They see an immediate sugar rush the moment they announce a project, and in doing so they try and announce as many details up front because they think it will capture people's imagination. You can't announce that at some point you're going to deliver a transport solution. You need to tell them how big the tunnels are, you need to have the sketches, you need to have everything that you can up front. You even sometimes, for some reason, need to announce the cost as you're doing this, which clearly is not going to be the cost that it turns out to be down the track. Costs drawn on the back of a napkin at the Qantas Club are clearly not going to stack up over the long term. Scopes change, costs rise, deadlines are missed, and sometimes maybe we're building the wrong thing as a result. One important note, and I think others have picked up on it, cost rises are not always a bad thing. I think it's a dirty word in some environments, but there is sometimes a need to change scope beyond what the minister has announced. In fact, if the minister has announced something in a rushed way, there is almost by definition a need to change the scope, and sometimes those things lead to greater net benefits to users over time. So we should be careful in how we analyse cost overruns, and it should only really be from the time of the first serious estimate when the bureaucrats have had their hands on the numbers and done the analysis that we measure whether or not a project has had a cost overrun. Clearly, early announcements lead to poorer outcomes over time. There's no surprises there. But what's missing from this equation is that there is a missed opportunity for governments to genuinely engage communities on infrastructure and to really talk about why it is infrastructure has become sexy, and that's about improving people's lives. So by taking this approach, they miss that opportunity because they don't have a conversation. They have a moment in time where they get an announcement. They don't get that longevity of selling the benefits of the project, which even from a purely political perspective seems like a missed opportunity. So a slightly better way. Clearly, there is a need to not announce everything up front. I think we can all agree on that. But there is a certain level of political appeal in taking communities on the journey. It swaps the sugar hit for a sort of series of healthy treats along the way. I'm no dietitian, I am a transport economist, and I know that that is a better way in transport economics. Government's announcing a planning process, that they're scoping up options, they want community views, that they're picking the project with the strongest benefits. These are all great opportunities for a press release, a press conference, standing in front of an open field. That's totally fine. What we don't want to see is the sod turn. In reality, politicians, they look silly with a shovel anyway, so it's probably for the best. Crucially, this stage approach gives governments the opportunity to sell the benefits of prospective projects and bring communities along with them. Long-term plans are essential not only for rigorous planning, problem identification and options assessment, but also for bipartisan buy-in across electoral cycles and across levels of government. Capturing the public's imagination requires thinking in terms that users and taxpayers understand. This is what politicians are supposed to be good at, it's what they're elected to do, and it's something that we should encourage, but we should encourage it within certain bounds. Instead, somewhat paradoxically, best practice for politicians these days is sometimes taken as submitting projects for benefit cost assessment once the scope has already been settled. In this context, benefit cost ratios become a kind of project high jump and a single measure of project merit. BCRs are a useful measure. They definitely have their place within project decision making, but they are no panacea. We're getting into the bit that I maybe wouldn't have said if I'd been at IA, but take that as you may. The benefits that make projects stack up for transport projects are well accepted, but are they intuitive? Are the things that we decide whether or not we build a project on the things by which infrastructure will be judged in future? Take travel time savings, for example. We attach a price to those minutes with the expectation those minutes will be spent productively. I feel like I'm a fairly productive person. However, if my commute is shorter than I thought it was going to be on the way home, I spend that time probably having a food fight or something with my 15-month-old daughter. I don't know how you attach empirically a value to that benefit. I certainly wouldn't attach a monetary value to it, especially considering I need to spend the next 10 minutes cleaning the carpet. There's also the small matter of how BCRs are developed and how the benefits stack is accumulated in project development. Anybody who has seen how a BCR sausage is made should be an immediate infrastructure vegan. It is absolutely not the kind of science that should be underpinning the grand scale of infrastructure investment that is made if that is the only analysis that you are doing. It is definitely a valuable tool, but the concept of squeezing enough transport benefits in terms of travel time savings to get a BCR to 1.05, making a project viable versus a project that scrapes in at 0.95 and not being viable is laughable. Most of the parameters on which these benefits are based are predictions into the future. Everyone here has heard all the jokes about economists and thinking about the future, predicting what could have possibly gone wrong 10 minutes after it does. Are all entirely true. Every economic forecast is wrong. We just need to be honest about that fact, and we need to treat benefit cost ratios within the realm of understanding in which they should be placed. To illustrate my point, I'm going to run through a quick couple of projects. So Monash Freeway widening is one that's probably, the text is very small, so I'll read it out. I used a different font. It was a better font, I think, but I'll see if I can go into as much detail as you want. So $711 million, it's providing extra lanes on the Monash Freeway. As an economic project, it's about as good as it gets in terms of large projects going around. The benefits stack up because it assumes that traffic will be travelling closer to 100 kilometres an hour than 70 kilometres an hour. And when you multiply that by the number of people travelling during peak hour on a 10-hour freeway, it's very easy to accumulate a lot of benefits. But will history judge this project as a roaring success, as the economic assessment suggests? Will it make Melbourne a better place? Melbourne Metro Tunnel. I've put a number there. I realised in my first presentation I'd like to change that number. However, I did put 2015 on it and it was P50. So for the cost estimators in the room, I hope it's still kind of within the realm of understanding. We all know about the project. The BCR is 1.1. Another cost blowout runs a risk of sending that BCR under 1. will that make it a bad project? It's going to transform rail within Melbourne CBD. It's an open question, but it's just a question around the scale of benefits and whether or not BCR should be the only measure. Sydney Light Rail. So I'm happy to have just got my number right on that one. So $2.7 billion is the latest cost, including some contractual issues. It's a 12.8 kilometre route. The BCR, let's just say it's around 1, because in 2014 the benefits were about $3 billion. Interestingly, the benefits are made up of public transport user benefits of 57%, operational savings of 18%, and webs are only 6%. And this is something I want to explore, because if you look at Sydney Light Rail and you look at what's happened along the line, you would see there's a huge amount of construction and renovation along the line to provide A-grade commercial real estate. Clearly, businesses are voting with their feet around this project. It's changed the fabric of Sydney already. Admittedly, it will be nicer when the bulldozers have left and the construction is gone, but George Street as a pedestrianised area has clearly added a lot of value, and that value can be monetised in some senses now that it's already in train and construction's taken slightly longer than expected. But webs of 6% doesn't seem to stack up with that. Is history going to judge Sydney Light Rail by the fact that it provided public transport user benefits of 57%? Anyone who knows about the project knows that they're light rail vehicles replacing buses, that broadly they have a similar capacity, if potentially a lower capacity, given the size of the vehicles and the frequency at which they can be run. It will be judged on the basis of how it transforms Sydney. But if these aren't the same benefits by which we're using to justify the project in the first place, then maybe something has gone a little bit wrong. Of course, this is not news to people living in Northern Australia. In a project I worked on at Infrastructure Australia before I left, which is the Australian Infrastructure Audit, coming out soon, quick plug. We look specifically at Northern Australia and how you provide economic infrastructure in Northern Australia. Clearly, it's not easy to make projects stack up, but it would be very hard to argue that a road project to a remote community that allows them to access essential health, education and job opportunities isn't important and isn't the kind of thing that Australia should be doing. Yet the BCR for those kinds of projects often comes out at 0.1 at best, if not lower, because of the methodology being used. So again, clearly governments have a role to invest in those places, and if BCRs aren't the reason or aren't the justification to invest, what is the better model? I think we all understand the point I'm trying to make, and so I'm going to move on. But I just want to reiterate the fact that BCRs are important. Clearly, Infrastructure Australia plays an important role within that, but there is only so much you can do when you get to the benefit case stage. So much is decided at an earlier stage, and so much relies on the strategic reasons, the vision in which infrastructure is being developed to ensure that that project then goes on to deliver strategic merit. So planning for future transport requires us to think 10 or 15 years into the future and consider what will make prospective projects a success. Governments communicating a vision around infrastructure can be an exciting concept, yet it seems governments lack the imagination and long-term conviction to engage communities on the merits of this approach. Crucially also, governments need to forge a more productive relationship with industry. Appropriate risk balance between government and industry is critical for delivering productive and lasting benefits, not just during construction, but also during operation. Social licence has taken a massive hit. There are countless projects across the country where things have gone wrong, and those things going wrong have either fallen at the feet of governments or industry in an operational sense during the operational phase of the project or during the construction phase. Very little focus is placed on the original strategic merit of the project and what went wrong in that decision-making process that we now find ourselves in those positions. Clearly, industry has a role to play in helping government to make better decisions, and clearly industry has skin in the game in that industry can make government look good and government can make industry look good. But all of it hinges on a robust strategic planning process at project origination so that industry can have a role in making the projects better before it's too late. One part of that is having clear transparency on pipeline. A strong, clear and dependable pipeline of works is essential for ensuring that we have the right industry in the country to deliver the infrastructure that we need efficiently. To help with this clarity, a few years ago, IPA developed the Australian-New Zealand Infrastructure Pipeline. It's a simple concept, information on all of Australia's infrastructure projects in one place, but it's one that didn't exist in any meaningful way before that. I was in a team that tried to create one when I was in Ben's department. I can tell you it was very difficult, and getting information out of states is more difficult than it should be. It is a genuinely, coming into IPA, it's a genuinely valuable resource to have there, but it's not done yet. There's a huge amount more work that can be built into it in terms of open contracting and extracting all the information from tendering and contracting that occurs at state government level and placing it in one place on a pipeline. So ANZIP provides clarity to industry, investors, the community, and yes, even governments on what stage of delivery each announcement is at. It is a great resource, is hugely popular, but still evolving. I think it's something like 10 times the number of hits on ANZIP than on the IPA website. So I think we're going to do a redesign on the website as well, and I'll be interested to see how that emerges. But it's clearly something that people rely on, and it's clearly something that has the capacity to grow. Extending this pipeline will give more confidence to the market, particularly those from overseas, that Australia is a great place to work and invest in infrastructure based on strong project decision making and governance, and that's obviously a critical element. Finally, I want to put in a plug for reform. There's a lot of talk about investment, but clearly investment without reform is not going to be as effective as it otherwise might be. Better meeting users' needs is not just about pumping infrastructure into economically beneficial projects. Investment alone will not deliver better services for users over the long term, even if we improve the rigour and robustness of infrastructure decisions. The good news is that there is a reform ready and waiting to be deployed. And right now, it only affects a minority of road users. Currently, electric vehicles pay nothing for use of the roads, as they avoid the existing and itself deeply flawed proxy as a road user charge in fuel excise. Over time, this will erode the funds available for infrastructure, and those who can't afford EVs will be shouldering more of the funding burden. This will drive poorer transport network outcomes, including higher congestion, as EV drivers face no charge at the point of use. At the same time, EVs are slugged with a range of taxes on the purchase of vehicles, including stamp duty and luxury car tax. This dampens uptake and means we are not tapping into the great benefits of EVs, including greenhouse gas and noxious emissions reductions. So, applying a road user charge for EVs while removing the taxes paid on vehicle purchase and registration could drive uptake. It could really transform how roads are paid for. It could transform where transport projects come from and the strategic reasons in which we do it. But the window of opportunity for implementing this reform with limited friction is closing. Governments may wish to consider applying a congestion charge for EVs in urban areas. The issue with this approach is that in the absence of a broad-based charge, and in particular when excise dies out, that leaves large parts of our networks where there is absolutely no price or cost for using the roads. And it doesn't take an economist to tell you that a price of zero is not a particularly efficient way of managing demand or funding supply. And contrary to some views in the transport sector today, the Netflix for roads model that you may have heard about does not mean that roads are magically going to pay for themselves. A Netflix for roads model where users pay a monthly subscription for transport services is a great idea. It's an idea that's been around for a while. It's called mobility as a service, and the concept is still evolving. But just as Netflix is a good name of a nut brand, just as Netflix doesn't deliver, that's patented by the way, nobody steals that, just as Netflix doesn't deliver the data cable to your house, or curb, or node, thank you NBN, so too will retail transport subscriptions not cover the wholesale costs of providing and maintaining roads and subsidising public transport services. So, in conclusion, clearly governments need to be on the front foot if they are to create a world in which infrastructure makes users' lives better. This requires commitment to the core principles of decision making, including setting a vision, engaging the community and being transparent. It also extends beyond investments to providing leadership on the reforms that will work in users' long-term interests. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I'm very happy to take any questions.